I stood alone at the defense table when the judge looked up from the file and asked who was representing me. The words were simple and ordinary, but the moment they landed in the room, everything tightened inside my chest. I said I was representing myself. My voice did not shake, at least not on the outside. For half a second, nothing happened. Then my father laughed. It was not a quiet chuckle or an embarrassed sound meant to stay small. It was loud and sharp and confident, the kind of laugh that assumes everyone else will join in. A few heads in the gallery turned. I saw the bailiff glance up from his post. Someone near the back let out a short breath that might have been a laugh too. My father leaned back in his chair and said something about how I could not afford a real lawyer anyway. He said it like a fact, like the weather, like something that did not need arguing. I did not look at him. I had learned a long time ago that meeting his eyes in moments like that only made things worse. Instead, I stared at the smooth wood of the table in front of me, at the faint scratch near the edge, at my own hands resting flat on either side of a thick binder I had brought with me. My hands were steady. I noticed that first, and it surprised me. The judge cleared his throat. He did not smile. He did not scold my father either. He simply nodded once and asked the other side to proceed. That was how it always went. Men like my father took up space. The room adjusted around them. I felt it then, the familiar heat creeping up my neck, the mix of embarrassment and anger in something older and heavier. It was the same feeling I had felt in school meetings when my accomplishments were brushed aside. The same feeling I had felt at family dinners when my brother spoke and everyone listened. And I spoke and the conversation moved on without pause. I was 58 years old, standing in a county courtroom in Dayton, Ohio, and somehow I was still that girl. Across the aisle, my mother sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was not laughing. She was not smiling either. She was doing what she had always done, keeping her face neutral, eyes fixed on a spot just past my shoulder. If she saw me at all, she did not let it show. I told myself not to look at her again. That hurt more than my father's laugh, and I did not need more of that right now. The lawyer representing my father and my brother rose smoothly from his chair. Thomas Klein, gray hair neatly combed, suit pressed just right. A man who looked like he belonged in rooms like this. He gave me a brief glance that carried 1,000 quiet judgments, not cruel exactly, just dismissive. The kind of look that says this will not take long. As he began to speak, I took a slow breath and placed my palm on the binder. The leather was worn from weeks of use. The tabs stuck out in neat rows, each one labeled in my own careful handwriting. I had checked them twice that morning in my kitchen, standing at the counter while the coffee went cold. I had checked them again in the parking lot before I walked inside, not because I thought I would forget what was inside, but because the ritual calmed me. Order had always been my anchor. The courtroom itself was smaller than television makes it look. Beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead, the smell of old carpet and stale paper, a place built for routine, not drama. And yet my heart was beating so hard I was sure someone nearby could hear it. Mr. Klein spoke about family decisions and practical considerations. He spoke about responsibility and intent. He spoke with the ease of someone who believed the ending had already been written, as he talked. My father nodded along, his mouth set in a thin line that meant approval. My brother sat beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes flicking toward me now and then like he was daring me to look back. I did not. Instead, I listened. I listened the way I had learned to listen during my years working with data, during long meetings where one missed detail could undo months of work. I listened for what was said and what was not said. I listened for the gaps. When Mr. Klein finished, the judge turned his attention to me. He asked if I wished to respond. This was the moment my father had been waiting for. I could feel it. This was the moment he expected me to falter, to ramble, to prove him right. I imagined the story already forming in his head. Laura always tries to do things on her own. Laura always thinks she knows better. Laura will embarrass herself. And then this will all be over. I stood. The chair made a soft sound against the floor as I pushed it back. It seemed loud in the quiet room. For a second, I felt every eye turn toward me. I adjusted the binder under my arm and walked to the small podium they had set up for self-represented parties. My shoes echoed once, twice, on the tile. I was aware of my breathing, slow and even, the way I had trained myself to breathe when pressure built. I placed the binder down and opened it to the first tab. I did not rush. I did not apologize. I did not look at my father. I began to speak. The first sentence left my mouth calmly, almost casually, but I saw the effect immediately. It was subtle at first. The lawyer across from me paused, just for a fraction of a second, like someone who has heard an unexpected note in a familiar song. The judge leaned forward slightly in his chair. The hum of the lights seemed louder because nothing else moved. I continued. The room did not erupt. No one gasped. There was no dramatic reaction. What happened instead was stranger and somehow more powerful. The shifting stopped. The whispering stopped. Even my father went still. It felt like the air itself had thickened, like we were all suspended in the same held breath. For the first time that morning, no one was laughing. I glanced up then, just briefly, and saw something cross my father's face that I had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, something closer to uncertainty. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it was there. I looked back down at my binder and kept going. As I spoke, a strange calm settled over me. The noise in my head quieted. The years of being talked over, of being underestimated, of being told I was fine and therefore did not need anything, faded into the background. In this moment, there was only the page in front of me and the words I had prepared. I did not know how this would end. I was not foolish enough to think one good sentence could undo decades of family dynamics or guarantee a victory. But I knew something had shifted. I could feel it in the way the judge watched me now, in the way the lawyer's confident posture had tightened, in the way my father no longer leaned back in his chair. And for the first time in my life, standing in a room where I had always felt small, I realized that being seen, truly seen, did not come from waiting for permission. It came from standing up and speaking, even when the people who were supposed to believe in you laughed first. I turned the page in my binder and took another breath, ready to continue, as the courtroom remained perfectly, unnervingly quiet. I kept my eyes on the page, but my mind drifted backward, the way it always did when the present pressed too hard. Moments like this never stood alone. They were echoes of something older, something that had been shaping me long before I knew how to name it. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Dayton, in a house that always looked tidy from the street. White siding, trimmed hedges, a flag out front on holidays. From the outside, we were respectable. Inside, there was an order that everyone understood without it ever being said out loud. My brother Daniel was the center of that order. He was 3 years younger than me, loud where I was quiet, restless where I was careful. When he walked into a room, my father's attention followed him automatically. Daniel talked, gestured, made promises about what he would do next. My father listened like those promises were investments that would pay off someday. I learned early that my role was different. I was the steady one, the one who did not cause trouble, the one who brought home good grades without being asked. When teachers called the house, it was usually to say I was doing well. My father would nod, say that was good, and then ask how Daniel was doing in sports. If Daniel brought home a poor grade, it became a discussion. What support he needed, what the teacher might be doing wrong. If I brought home a good one, it was expected. My father would say, "Let us see if you can keep it up." My mother would smile softly and remind me not to brag. She meant well, I think. Margaret believed deeply in keeping the peace. She believed that families stayed together by smoothing rough edges, by swallowing small hurts before they turned into larger ones. When my father dismissed something I had said, she would catch my eye and give a look that meant let it go. Later, in the kitchen, she would tell me that he did not mean it, that he was tired, that he showed love in his own way. Over time, those explanations stacked up. I learned to accept them the way you accept the weather. This is how it is. This is what you get. Be grateful it is not worse. There was a phrase my parents used often when talking about me. Laura is fine. It sounded like praise at first. Fine meant capable. Fine meant independent. Fine meant they did not have to worry. But fine also meant invisible. Fine meant overlooked. Fine meant being passed over when decisions were made. When I was 13, Daniel decided he wanted to try out for baseball. My father bought him new equipment that same weekend, a bat, a glove, cleats that still smelled like rubber and leather. I had been asking about joining the swim team for months. When I brought it up again, my father asked why anyone would want to watch girls swim. My mother suggested I focus on my studies instead. I did not argue. I nodded. I went back to my room and did my homework. That pattern repeated itself in small ways year after year. When Daniel wanted to change schools, it became a family conversation. When I mentioned applying for a summer program, my father asked how much it would cost. When Daniel failed his driving test, my father said everyone has off days. When I passed on my first try, my mother told me to be patient with my brother. I do not remember a single moment when anyone asked me what I wanted, not in a way that suggested the answer might matter. By the time I reached my late teens, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost comforting. If I stayed, nothing would change. I would always be the reliable one, the daughter who managed on her own, the person others leaned on without looking too closely. I loved my family, but loving them felt like slowly erasing myself. Leaving was not dramatic. There was no big fight, no slammed doors. I told my parents I had accepted a position out of state. My father nodded and said that made sense. My mother hugged me and told me she was proud. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. As I packed my car, I remember thinking that no one was trying to stop me. At the time, that felt like freedom. Later, it would feel like something else entirely. Years passed. Life happened. I built a career that required precision and discipline. I learned how to speak in rooms where every word mattered. I learned how to prepare so thoroughly that confidence came not from bravado, but from knowing my facts cold. When things went well, I celebrated quietly. When they did not, I adjusted and kept moving. Every holiday, I returned home. The house looked the same. My father grew older, more rigid in his routines. My mother moved more slowly, her kindness turning inward. Daniel floated from one idea to the next, always convinced the next plan would be the one that worked. My role never shifted. I brought dishes, fixed small problems, wrote checks when something needed repair. No one asked where the money came from. No one said thank you. When my mother's health began to fail, I came home more often. I rearranged my life without hesitation, sitting beside her hospital bed, listening to the machines hum. I felt a deep, aching tenderness for her. She squeezed my hand and told me I was strong. She told me she did not know what she would do without me. Even then, the word lingered, strong, as if strength meant needing nothing in return. After she passed, the house felt quieter in a way that settled into my bones. I assumed, without discussion, that her wishes would be honored. She had always been careful. She had written things down. She believed in fairness, even when she avoided conflict. I was wrong. Standing in that courtroom years later, hearing my father laugh, I realized how little had changed beneath the surface. The setting was different, the stakes were higher, but the roles were exactly the same. Daniel was still being protected. My father was still certain of his authority. My mother was still silent. And I was still the one expected to absorb the impact. As I turned another page in my binder, the weight of all those years pressed against my ribs, not as bitterness, but as understanding. This moment did not come out of nowhere. It was built from every time I had been told I was fine, and therefore did not need to be heard. I steadied my breath and focused on what came next, knowing that the story I had lived until now was about to collide with the one unfolding in front of me. That understanding followed me out of the courtroom and into memories of the first time I realized there might be another way to exist. Leaving Ohio did not feel brave when I did it. It felt necessary, like stepping out of a room that had slowly been filling with smoke. I accepted a position with a federal contractor based in Northern Virginia, working in data analysis. The job description was dry, almost boring, but the work itself demanded focus and care. Patterns mattered, details mattered. If you missed something small, it could ripple outward in ways no one saw until it was too late. On my first day, I sat at a long table with people I did not know, all of us waiting for orientation to begin. No one asked about my family. No one assumed anything about me. I was simply another person with a notebook and a badge. That anonymity felt like a gift. I worked hard, not because I wanted praise, but because I liked the clarity of effort and result lining up cleanly. When I spoke in meetings, people listened. When I asked questions, they answered without impatience. When I delivered a report on time and without errors, my supervisor nodded and said good work. It was said plainly, without qualifiers. No one added that we would see if I could keep it up. Over time, I was trusted with more responsibility. The work grew more complex. The stakes higher. I learned how to prepare before I ever opened my mouth. I learned that confidence does not need volume. It needs foundation. I watched louder colleagues stumble when pressed for specifics, and quieter ones succeed because they knew exactly what they were talking about. In those rooms, I was not fine. I was competent. I was respected. Every time I returned home for holidays, the contrast was jarring. I would walk into the familiar kitchen, the same linoleum floor, the same magnets on the refrigerator, and feel myself shrink slightly without meaning to. My father would ask about my job in a vague way, then turn the conversation back to Daniel. Daniel was always on the verge of something, a new business idea, a new connection, a new opportunity that just needed one more chance. At dinner, I would listen as my father offered advice, encouragement, sometimes money. My mother would serve plates and remind everyone to eat while it was hot. When I mentioned a project I had worked on, my father would nod and say that sounded nice. Then he would ask Daniel how things were going. I stopped volunteering details after a while. It was easier that way. When something broke in the house, I paid to have it fixed. When my parents needed help navigating paperwork, I handled it. I did these things quietly, without announcement, because that was how I had always operated. I told myself it did not matter whether anyone noticed, but it did. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. The first time I realized Daniel was struggling financially was not because he told me. It was because a bill arrived at the house addressed to him, marked urgent. My mother handed it to me with a worried look and asked if I could make sense of it. I did. I also noticed how quickly my father waved it away, saying Daniel would figure it out. He always did. When I suggested Daniel might need to adjust his plans or get steady work, my father bristled. He said I did not understand. He said Daniel just needed support. He said things had a way of working out. I nodded and let it go. That was my role. Years later, when my mother began to slow down, when the lightness in her step faded and her hands shook more often, I came home more frequently. I adjusted my schedule, turned down opportunities that would have required travel, sitting beside her on the couch, watching old television shows. I felt a tenderness that surprised me with its intensity. She told me she was glad I was there. She said she could always count on me. Even then, I was the one she leaned on quietly. My father handled appointments and decisions. Daniel came by when it suited him. I handled the spaces in between, the medications, the meals, the nights when sleep would not come. When she passed, something in the house changed. The silence was heavier. My father moved through the rooms like a man guarding something fragile. Daniel talked about the future, I assumed, without ever discussing it, that the house would remain as it was until everything was sorted properly. My mother had been careful. She believed in fairness. She believed that avoiding conflict did not mean avoiding clarity. I returned to Virginia after the funeral, carrying grief and a sense of unfinished business I could not quite name. Life resumed its rhythm. Work continued. I took on consulting projects, still valued for my attention to detail. I lived alone, quietly, with routines that suited me. Then the call came. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister. Her voice lowered as if someone might overhear even through the phone. She told me she had heard something troubling. She said my father and Daniel were planning to transfer the house into Daniel's name. She said it was happening quickly. She said she thought I should know. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not shock exactly, more like recognition, a pattern revealing itself once again. I drove home that weekend. The house looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything felt off. Papers were stacked on the dining table. Daniel avoided my eyes. My father spoke briskly, like this was already settled. When I asked what was going on, he said they were making practical decisions. He said Daniel needed help. He said I was not around enough to have a say. I reminded him of my mother's wishes. He waved it away. He said things were different now. He said I would be fine. That word again, standing in the courtroom years later. I could trace a clean line from that conversation to the moment my father laughed. It was the same assumption wearing a different suit. The belief that I could absorb loss without consequence. The belief that strength meant silence. As I shifted my weight slightly and waited for the judge to respond to my next point, I understood something with a clarity that steadied me. The life I had built away from home was not an escape. It was preparation. Everything I had learned about listening, about patience, about speaking only when I was ready, had led me here. The question was no longer whether I deserved to be heard. It was what I was willing to do now that I finally was. That question stayed with me as I walked through the front door of the house that had once felt like the safest place in the world. The house sat on a quiet street in Beaver Creek, not far from where I grew up. My parents bought it in the late 90s, when everything still felt possible. From the outside, it was ordinary. 2 stories, pale siding, a maple tree in the front yard that had grown taller than all of us over the years. But inside, every room held my mother's fingerprints. Not literally, of course, but in the way the curtains hung just so, in the way the light hit the kitchen table in the late afternoon, in the faint smell of lemon cleaner that never quite went away. I stepped inside and felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Grief does that. It sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Even years later, the air felt heavier than it should have, like the house itself was holding its breath. My father was already there, seated at the dining table with a stack of papers spread in front of him. Daniel stood near the counter, scrolling on his phone. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. "You came quick," my father said without looking up. I asked what the papers were. He said they were just documents, nothing I needed to worry about. That alone told me everything. I moved closer and saw the header on the top page. Property transfer. Legal language dense enough to intimidate anyone not used to reading it. I felt the old instinct kick in, the one that had carried me through years of work. Slow down, Tug. Read carefully. Ask the right questions. I asked whose idea this was. My father finally looked at me then. His expression was firm, almost rehearsed. He said the house needed to be handled responsibly. He said Daniel needed stability. He said it made sense to put the property in Daniel's name. I reminded him that the house had belonged to Mom too. I reminded him that she had written things down, that she had been clear about wanting things split evenly. I expected resistance. I did not expect dismissal. "You are not here," he said. "You live your life somewhere else. Daniel is the one who has been around." That was not true, not really, but it was determined enough to pass as truth in his mind. Daniel finally looked up from his phone. He shrugged and said this was not a big deal. He said the house would probably be sold anyway. He said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I asked if they planned to sell it. Daniel hesitated just long enough to give himself away. My father answered instead. He said that was none of my concern. I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger. Anger would have been easier. This was something colder. A realization that the ground beneath me had been unstable for a long time, and I had simply learned how to balance on it. I asked where Mom's will was. My father waved his hand like he was brushing away a fly. He said wills could be interpreted. He said things change after someone dies. He said I would be fine. That word again? I looked around the room, the dining table where my mother used to sit with her coffee every morning, the cabinet where she kept the good dishes she only brought out for holidays, the hallway where she used to stop and straighten pictures that were already straight. This was not just property. It was history. It was memory. It was her. I told them I would not sign anything. My father laughed then, not as loudly as he would later in the courtroom, but with the same confidence. He said I did not have a choice. He said legal matters cost money. He said I was being unrealistic. Daniel leaned back against the counter and said I always liked to play the martyr. He said this was why I never fit in. My mother was not there to hear it. That thought cut deeper than any insult. I left the house that day with my hands shaking and my jaw clenched so tight it ached. I sat in my car for a long time before turning the key. I stared at the front door, half expecting my father to come out and stop me. He did not. On the drive back, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Carol. She asked how it went. I told her the truth. She sighed and said she was afraid of that. She said my mother had worried about this very thing. She said my mother had trusted that things would be handled fairly, but had never quite believed it. That night, alone in a small hotel room, I took out the copy of my mother's handwritten will that I had kept folded in a drawer for years. I had not looked at it since the funeral. I read it slowly, line by line. It was simple, direct. My mother had never liked unnecessary complications. She wanted the house divided equally between her children. She wanted things to be fair. I slept poorly. I dreamed of walking through the house and finding rooms missing, doorways leading nowhere. The next morning, I drove back to Virginia with a knot in my stomach and a sense of inevitability I could not shake. The life I had built there suddenly felt fragile, like something temporary I might be asked to give up. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had been absent long enough to be erased. Weeks passed. Emails went unanswered. When my father did respond, his messages were short and clipped. Daniel stopped responding altogether. I heard through my aunt that paperwork was moving forward, quietly, quickly. That was when I understood something important. Silence was no longer neutral. It was permission. I began to read, not out of rage, but out of necessity. I started with the basics: probate law in Ohio, handwritten wills, property transfers after death. The language was dry, unforgiving, but familiar in its own way. It reminded me of the technical documents I had worked with for years, dense, precise, uninterested in feelings. The more I read, the clearer things became. There were rules, timelines, requirements that could not simply be waved away because someone was confident enough to try. I did not tell my father what I was doing. I did not tell Daniel. I did not even tell my aunt the full extent of it. This was something I needed to do quietly, the way I always had. There were nights when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I was overreacting, when I heard my mother's voice in my head telling me to keep the peace, when I imagined the looks from people in town if this became public. Shame is powerful like that. It tries to dress itself up as reason. But then I would picture my mother at the kitchen table, pen in hand, carefully forming each letter of her will. She had wanted to be fair. She had trusted us to honor that. I realized then that this was not about winning. It was about refusing to disappear. The decision to go to court did not come with a rush of adrenaline or a feeling of triumph. It came quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, as I closed my laptop and looked out the window of my apartment. The sky was overcast. Traffic moved steadily below. Life went on, indifferent to my internal reckoning. I knew what it would cost me. Not just money, though that mattered. It would cost me whatever fragile peace remained in my family. It would expose things everyone had been content to ignore. It would make me the difficult one, the daughter who would not let things slide. But for the first time, that label did not scare me. As I gathered my notes and began to organize them into something more concrete, I felt a strange sense of calm settle in, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from alignment. I was finally moving in the same direction as my own values. Standing later in that courtroom, binder open, voices hushed around me, I carried all of this with me: the house, my mother's handwriting, the years of being fine. And I knew with a steadiness I had never felt before that whatever happened next, I would not be erased quietly again. That steadiness did not protect me from what came next. It only made it clearer. Once my father realized I would not quietly step aside, his tone changed. The phone calls stopped. The emails, when they came at all, were short and formal, stripped of anything that resembled affection. Daniel sent one message, just one, telling me I was blowing things out of proportion and embarrassing the family. After that, nothing. When I did manage to speak to my father, the conversations followed the same pattern. He told me I was being stubborn. He told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. He told me I was turning a private family matter into something ugly. Each time, he returned to the same point. I was not around. I had chosen my life elsewhere. Therefore, I did not get a say. The logic was neat and cruel at the same time. I tried, once, to explain myself. I reminded him of the money I had sent over the years, for the roof repairs that never seemed to happen, for the water heater, for the small emergencies that always landed on my plate. I reminded him of the weekends I drove back when Mom was sick, of the nights I slept on the couch so she would not be alone. He dismissed all of it with a wave of his hand. He said that was different. He said Daniel had been physically present. He said proximity mattered more than anything else. It was then that I understood something that had always been there, but never fully articulated. In my family, effort only counted if it was visible in the right way. Quiet consistency did not register. Sacrifice without spectacle was easy to ignore. My mother finally called me one evening. Her voice was soft, tired. She said she wished things did not have to be so tense. She said she did not understand why I was pushing so hard. She said families should not take each other to court. I asked her if she believed what was happening was fair. There was a pause on the line, a long one. When she spoke again, she did not answer the question directly. She said my father was under a lot of stress. She said Daniel needed support. She said she was worried about what people would think if this became public. I felt something sink in my chest. It was not anger at her. It was disappointment, layered over years of similar moments. Even now, when everything was at stake, she was asking me to be the one who absorbed the damage so everyone else could stay comfortable. I told her I loved her. I told her I did not want to fight, but I also told her I could not pretend this was nothing. She grew quiet, and when we hung up, I sat alone in my living room long after the call ended, staring at the dark television screen. That was the night I finally stopped hoping someone would step in and fix this for me. The pressure did not come only from inside my family. Word traveled quickly in a town like Beaver Creek. I began to hear through my aunt that people were talking, that some were saying I was greedy, that others said I was ungrateful. At church, my parents received sympathetic looks. Poor Richard, dealing with such a difficult daughter. I could picture it easily. I had seen that dynamic play out for other families over the years. Shame has a way of reaching you even when you are not physically present. For a few days, I wavered. I wondered if I was doing the right thing. I wondered if I should back down, let the house go, preserve whatever version of family remained. I heard my mother's voice in my head telling me to keep the peace. I heard my father telling me I was fine, that I would land on my feet no matter what. Then I looked at my notes, at the timelines I had sketched out, at the clear sequence of events that showed how quickly things were being moved along without my consent. And I realized something that cut through the doubt. Peace built on erasure is not peace. It is surrender. I decided then that if this was going to happen, it would happen in the open. I went to the county courthouse in Dayton the following week. The building was unremarkable, brick and glass, the kind of place people pass every day without noticing. Inside, a clerk directed me to the records office. I told her what I was looking for. She raised an eyebrow, but she did not question me. She handed me a stack of forms and pointed me toward a row of terminals. I spent hours there, pulling documents, cross-checking dates, noting inconsistencies. I saw the beginnings of the transfer paperwork. I saw signatures that did not quite line up. I saw how fast things were moving, how little room there was for error if I waited too long. When I got back to my car, the sun was already low in the sky. I sat there with the door open, the warm air brushing against my face, and felt the weight of what I was doing settle fully onto my shoulders. This was no longer theoretical. This was real. I filed my objection a few days later. I paid the filing fee with a check I had written carefully, deliberately. When the clerk stamped the paperwork and slid it back to me, something inside me shifted. There was no turning back now. My father found out quickly. He called me, his voice sharp with disbelief. He asked me what I thought I was doing. He said I was humiliating the family. He said I was acting like I knew better than everyone else. He said I was making him look bad. I told him I was protecting my mother's wishes. He scoffed and said I did not have the money or the expertise to follow through. He said lawyers cost more than I could afford. He said I should drop this before it got worse. That was when he said it. The sentence that echoed later in the courtroom. He said I could not afford a lawyer anyway. He laughed, just a little, like the idea amused him. Something inside me went very still. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him I would see this through. When he hung up on me, my hands were trembling, but my resolve was not. Daniel sent another message that night. He said I was tearing the family apart. He said I always had to be right. He said I should think about Mom. I did think about her. I thought about her handwriting, about the care she took with small things, about how much she valued fairness, even when she avoided confrontation. And I realized that honoring her did not mean staying quiet. It meant refusing to let her be rewritten. The weeks that followed were heavy. I felt the strain in my body, in the way my shoulders stayed tight, in the way sleep came in shallow bursts. I avoided social gatherings. I stopped answering calls from numbers I recognized. I focused on preparation, because that was the one thing I could control. By the time the court date was set, the narrative in my family was fixed. I was the problem. I was the disruptor. I was the one who could not let things go. Standing in that courtroom later, hearing my father laugh, I understood exactly how we had arrived there. This was not a sudden conflict. It was the natural result of years of being told to stay quiet for the sake of others. As the judge prepared to respond to my argument, I felt the familiar pressure of expectation bearing down on me. The expectation that I would yield, that I would shrink, that I would be fine. I lifted my eyes from the binder and waited, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, one way or another. Waiting became its own discipline. Once the court date was set, time seemed to slow and speed up at the same time. Days dragged. Nights collapsed into short, restless stretches of sleep. I learned quickly that preparation was not a burst of effort. It was endurance. Showing up for myself over and over, even when doubt whispered that this was foolish, that I was alone, that I was about to lose more than I could afford. I turned my small apartment into a workspace. The dining table became a map of my thoughts. Papers spread out in careful stacks, one pile for the timeline, one for property records, one for correspondence. I labeled everything, not because I was obsessive, but because clarity keeps panic at bay. When things are named, they are easier to face. Most mornings I woke before dawn. Coffee brewed while the city outside was still quiet. I sat at the table with a yellow legal pad and rewrote the sequence of events until I could recite it without looking. Dates, signatures, who knew what and when. I had done this kind of work for years, just in different contexts. Instead of threats and data sets, it was deeds and probate rules. The process felt familiar, even if the subject matter cut closer to home. Some afternoons I went to the law library downtown. The building was old and smelled faintly of dust and toner. I liked it there. No one asked questions. No one cared why a woman my age was pulling state statutes and case summaries. I read until my eyes ached, learning the language slowly, translating it into something I could hold in my head. Probate law was not emotional. It did not care about family dynamics or hurt feelings. It cared about procedure, about what had been done correctly and what had not. That objectivity steadied me. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all pressed too hard. One evening, after hours of reading, I found myself staring at the same paragraph without absorbing a single word. My mind drifted back to my mother, to the way she used to fold laundry at the kitchen table, humming softly to herself. I wondered what she would say if she could see me now. Would she tell me to keep the peace? Would she tell me I was right? Or would she just listen, the way she always had, letting me decide for myself? Those thoughts were dangerous. They softened my resolve in ways I could not afford. When doubt crept in, it came disguised as reason. You are tired. This is too much. Let it go, sell the house, move on. I heard my father's voice in those moments, calm and certain. You will be fine. You always are. I started writing those doubts down, not to indulge them, but to see them clearly. Once they were on paper, they lost some of their power. I could answer them with facts, with preparation, with the simple truth that fairness mattered, even when it was inconvenient. One afternoon, I called Mark Alvarez. We had worked together years ago, back when I was still full-time with the federal contractor. Mark had a legal background before moving into analysis, and I trusted his mind. I did not give him the whole story. I did not need to. I asked general questions about probate timelines, about how judges tend to think. He listened, then offered a few clarifications that helped me tighten my approach. At the end of the call, he paused and said something that stayed with me. He said people underestimate quiet preparation because they never see it coming. He said most conflicts are decided long before anyone steps into a courtroom. I wrote that sentence at the top of my notes and underlined it. The pressure from my family did not ease. If anything, it intensified in its own subtle way. My mother stopped calling altogether. That hurt more than the arguments ever had. Silence can be louder than words when you know what it means. Daniel sent one more message, accusing me of enjoying the attention, I did not respond. There was nothing left to say that would change his mind. I focused instead on what I could control. I practiced speaking out loud in my living room, not performing, just stating facts clearly, evenly. I timed myself. I learned where my voice tended to rush and forced myself to slow down. I knew that if I sounded defensive, it would only confirm the narrative they had built about me. Some nights, exhaustion caught up with me. I would sit on the couch, documents spread around me, and feel the urge to cry without quite knowing why. Not because I was afraid of losing, because I was finally seeing, with painful clarity, how alone I had always been in moments that mattered. And yet, beneath that sadness, there was something else growing, a sense of alignment I had not felt before. I was no longer bending myself to fit someone else's comfort. I was acting in accordance with my own values, and that brought a strange kind of peace. The week before the hearing, I organized my materials into binders, 4 of them, each color-coded, each tabbed and labeled. I lifted them once they were finished and laughed quietly to myself at the weight. It felt symbolic somehow. All those years of being told I carried things well, here it was, tangible and heavy in my hands. The night before court, I did not sleep much. I lay awake listening to the distant sound of traffic, replaying everything in my mind. Not the arguments, but the sequence. If this, then that. If asked this, respond with that. I reminded myself that I did not need to convince anyone of my worth. I only needed to present the truth clearly. In the morning, I dressed carefully, nothing flashy, nothing apologetic. Comfortable shoes, a jacket that fit well. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because of the steadiness in her eyes. I had earned that. Driving to the courthouse, my hands were calm on the steering wheel. My heart beat faster as I pulled into the parking lot. But it was not panic. It was readiness. I gathered the binders, locked the car, and stood for a moment in the cool air, grounding myself. Inside, the building felt the same as it always had. Neutral, impersonal. I checked in, took a seat, and waited. When my father and brother arrived with their lawyer, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. But it passed quickly. They were confident, relaxed, certain of the outcome. I was quiet. When my case was called and I walked into the courtroom, binder in hand, I carried with me every early morning, every late night, every moment of doubt I had worked through rather than around. I took my place at the table and waited for the proceedings to begin. Whatever happened next would not erase the work I had done. And as I settled into my chair, eyes forward, I knew that alone made this moment different from any that had come before. The air in the courtroom felt heavier once everyone was seated. I took my place at the small table reserved for self-represented parties, setting the binders down carefully, one on top of the other. The leather covers made a dull sound against the wood. It grounded me. Across the aisle, my father sat with Daniel and Thomas Klein. They looked relaxed, almost bored, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a turning point. My father leaned back in his chair, arms folded loosely. Daniel checked his phone until Klein nudged him and whispered something under his breath. My mother slipped into the row behind them a few minutes later. She sat down quietly, smoothing her skirt, eyes forward. She did not look at me. I felt that familiar sting, sharp and brief, then pushed it aside. I did not have room for it today. When the judge entered, everyone stood. He was a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose. He looked tired in the way people do when they have seen too many versions of the same conflict. He took his seat, glanced at the file in front of him, and began calling the case. As the formalities unfolded, I became acutely aware of the small sounds in the room, the scrape of a chair leg, the shuffle of papers, the cough of someone in the gallery. Each noise felt amplified, as if my senses had sharpened in response to the tension. Thomas Klein rose smoothly when it was his turn. He introduced himself and his clients, speaking with practiced ease. He framed the situation as a reasonable family decision made under difficult circumstances. He spoke of responsibility, of protecting assets, of practicality. His voice carried confidence, the kind that assumes agreement rather than seeking it. As he spoke, I watched my father nod along, his mouth set in a line of satisfaction. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking pleased with himself. My mother sat very still, hands folded, eyes fixed on the judge. I listened closely, not just to the words, but to the omissions. Klein did not mention the speed with which the paperwork had moved. He did not mention my mother's handwritten will. He did not mention the lack of my consent. Those gaps mattered. When he finished, the judge turned his gaze to me. He asked if I wished to respond. Before I could speak, my father shifted in his seat and let out a short laugh. It was not as loud as it had been earlier in the day, but it was deliberate. He leaned forward slightly and said that I was representing myself because I could not afford a lawyer. He said it casually, almost helpfully, as if he were clarifying something for the court. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Someone in the gallery chuckled. Klein smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting in what might have been sympathy, or might have been something else entirely. I felt the heat rise again, that old instinct to shrink, to disappear. For a moment, I saw myself at the kitchen table as a teenager, being told not to make a fuss. I saw myself nodding, letting the moment pass. Then the moment did not pass. The judge did not respond to my father's comment. He did not admonish him either. He simply turned back to me and repeated the question. Did I wish to respond? I stood. The chair slid back softly. I could feel my heart beat in my ears, steady and strong. I carried the top binder to the podium and set it down. Opening it to the first tab, I took a breath, slow and deliberate. I was aware of every eye on me, but I did not rush to fill the silence. Silence has weight if you let it. When I spoke, my voice sounded calm to my own ears. Not loud, not defensive, just clear. I began by stating a simple fact about the timeline of the property transfer. Nothing dramatic, just a date, a sequence, something concrete. I saw Klein's expression change slightly. Not alarm, not yet, just attention. I continued, moving carefully through the events as they had actually happened. I referenced the handwritten will my mother had completed years earlier, explaining its relevance under Ohio probate law. I cited the statute I had studied so many times I could recite it from memory. I watched the judge lean forward, his pen pausing over the page. The room grew quiet. No one interrupted. No one laughed. Even my father had gone still. I did not look at him, but I could feel the shift in his posture, the way confidence tightens when it meets resistance. Klein cleared his throat and attempted to interject. He said something about interpretation, about context. The judge raised a hand gently and told him to let me finish. That small gesture sent a jolt through me. Not triumph, permission. I went on. I spoke about the lack of notification, about the absence of my signature, about the speed with which the paperwork had been filed. I moved slowly, methodically, connecting one point to the next, each sentence built on the last, not as an argument, but as a pattern. As I turned a page in the binder, I glanced up and saw my mother watching me, really watching. Her face was chill, her mouth slightly open, as if she were seeing me from a new angle. The sight of it unsettled me more than my father's laughter ever had. Daniel shifted in his seat, crossing and uncrossing his legs. His confidence had dimmed. He looked toward my father, then back at the judge, his jaw tight. When I referenced the discrepancies in the signatures on the transfer documents, Klein's smile disappeared entirely. He leaned closer to his client and whispered something urgent. My father shook his head, his lips pressed together now, the laugh gone. I was careful not to sound accusatory. I did not raise my voice. I did not speculate beyond what the documents supported. I simply laid the pieces out and let them speak. By the time I finished that first section, the atmosphere in the room had changed. It was subtle but unmistakable. People were no longer watching to see me fail. They were listening. The judge asked a clarifying question. I answered it directly, citing the relevant page. He nodded once and made a note. Klein stood again, this time with less ease. He attempted to reframe, to smooth over what had been presented. His words felt heavier now, as if they were dragging something behind them. He spoke of intent, of family understanding, of informal agreements. The judge listened, then turned back to me. "Do you have anything further at this time?" he asked. I did. I opened the binder to the next tab and prepared to continue, aware that this was only the beginning. The tension in the room had not broken. It had sharpened. My father watched me now with something like disbelief. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. I took another breath, feeling the weight of what was unfolding, and began to speak again, knowing that every word from here on would land harder than the last. I shifted my stance slightly and felt the familiar calm settle deeper into place. The next section mattered more than the first. The first had opened the door. This one would decide whether anyone actually walked through it. I turned another page and continued, explaining how the transfer paperwork had been initiated less than 3 weeks after my mother passed. Before the estate had gone through probate, I kept my voice even, careful not to rush. I described the steps that had been skipped, the notices that had not been sent, the consent that had never been requested. These were not opinions, they were facts, each one tied to a document now resting on the bench in front of the judge. Judge Harold Simmons listened without interruption. He did not nod encouragement. He did not frown, he simply listened, pen moving slowly across the page. That restraint gave his attention weight. Thomas Klein tried again to step in, this time with more urgency. He suggested that the paperwork was merely administrative, that families often handled matters informally, that everyone understood what was intended. His words hung in the air, thinner now, less confident. The judge held up a hand and asked him to wait. I felt the room lean toward me. I moved to the next point, the one I had practiced most carefully. I explained that the will of my mother was handwritten, yes, but valid under Ohio law when certain conditions were met. I outlined those conditions clearly and showed how each had been satisfied. I could see the judge glance at the statute copy I had provided, then back at me. When I mentioned the date on the will, I saw my mother shift in her seat. Her hands tightened together, knuckles pale. She looked down, then back up at me, her eyes wet. I kept going. I pointed out the inconsistencies in the signatures on the transfer documents. I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I simply stated that the signatures did not match prior records on file, including earlier tax forms. I offered the comparison pages. The judge studied them carefully. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely now. No one whispered. No one shifted. Even the bailiff stood straighter. Daniel could not sit still. He leaned forward, then back, rubbing his hands together. He whispered something to my father, who shook his head sharply. The confidence that had filled the room at the start of the hearing had drained away, leaving something raw and exposed. Klein tried to recover. He argued that intent should matter more than procedure. He said the family had acted in good faith. He said my father was simply trying to help his son. That was when I felt something tighten inside me. Not anger, but clarity. When the judge looked to me again, I spoke before Klein could finish his thought. I apologized briefly for interrupting, then continued, keeping my tone respectful. I said intent does not override statute. I said good faith does not erase required process. I said fairness cannot exist when one party is excluded entirely. The judge did not correct me. My father stared straight ahead now, jaw set, his earlier laughter a distant memory. I had never seen him look so small in a public space. The sight stirred something complicated in me, a mix of sorrow and resolve. I turned to the final binder and opened it slowly. This was the part I had hesitated over, not because it was weak, but because it would sting. I explained that there was a financial motive underlying the urgency of the transfer. I presented documentation showing outstanding debts tied to Daniel over the past 2 years. Notices, late payments, collection letters. I laid them out carefully, without embellishment. Daniel shot to his feet. His face flushed. He started to speak, then stopped when the judge raised his hand. The sound of his chair scraping back echoed sharply in the quiet room. My father reached out and tugged at his sleeve, forcing him back down. The judge examined the documents, his expression unreadable. He asked a few direct questions. I answered each one, referencing specific pages. Klein attempted to object on relevance grounds. The judge overruled him calmly and continued reading. I felt my pulse in my throat, but my hands remained steady on the binder. When I finished, I closed the folder and stepped back slightly. I did not add anything else. I did not repeat myself. I had learned that repetition weakens a point once it has landed. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It was not tension anymore. It was reckoning. Judge Simmons leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, then looked up at my father. He asked him to explain why the transfer had been rushed and why consent had not been obtained from both heirs. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. He tried again, his voice lower than I had ever heard it in public. He said he was trying to do what was best for his family. He said Daniel needed help. He said I had always been independent. There it was, the familiar refrain. The judge listened, then asked a single follow-up question. He asked whether my mother had ever expressed a desire for unequal treatment between her children. My father did not answer right away. My mother let out a quiet sound behind him. Not a word, just a breath that carried years of unsaid things. My father turned slightly, as if startled by her presence. She did not speak. She did not need to. The answer was written on her face. Judge Simmons nodded once, slowly. He addressed the room, stating that based on the evidence presented, the transfer of property could not proceed as filed. He said the will of my mother would stand pending full probate review. He said further examination of the signatures and timing would be required before any disposition of the house. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the ruling. He stated it plainly, as if this outcome had always been inevitable once the facts were laid out. Daniel reacted first. He muttered something under his breath and stood again, frustration radiating off him. My father grabbed his arm, harder this time, and pulled him back down. Their whispered argument filled the space briefly before the judge called for order. I stood there, absorbing the words slowly. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and heavier. Validation, perhaps, or recognition. The judge scheduled the next steps and called for a brief recess. As the gavel struck the block, the sound echoed through my chest. People in the gallery began to move again, the spell breaking. Conversations sparked up in low tones. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled. My father turned and looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes now. No superiority, only something like confusion, maybe even fear. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. My mother remained seated, her hands pressed together, eyes fixed on the floor. She looked older in that moment than I had ever seen her. I gathered my binders slowly, stacking them carefully the way I always had. My hands trembled slightly now that the tension had loosened, but I did not mind. It reminded me that I was human. As I stepped away from the table and toward the aisle, I knew this was not over. Not legally, not emotionally, but something fundamental had shifted. The story my family had told about me no longer fit the facts in front of us. And for the first time, they could not pretend otherwise. I paused near the doorway as the room continued to buzz behind me, aware that the next chapter would not be decided by paperwork alone. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it had a few minutes earlier. People spilled out in small clusters, voices low, glances curious. I moved slowly, binders held tight against my chest, letting the noise pass around me. My legs felt heavy now that the tension had released, like I had been holding myself upright on adrenaline alone. My father emerged a moment later, his shoulders stiff, his face set in a way I recognized from years ago. This was the look he wore when something had not gone according to plan, and he could not immediately blame someone else for it. Daniel followed close behind, jaw clenched, eyes sharp with frustration. Thomas Klein stayed back, already on his phone, his voice hushed but urgent. My father stepped toward me, stopping just close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne. He demanded to know what that was about. He asked how I could do this to him. His voice was low but shaking, anger tangled with something else I could not quite name. I told him quietly that I had not done anything to him. I said I had told the truth. He scoffed and said truth was not the issue. He said family loyalty mattered more. He said people would talk now. He said this would not end well. Daniel jumped in then, his words spilling out fast and sharp. He said I had blindsided them. He said I had made him look like a criminal. He said I had no idea what I had just done. I listened without interrupting, my grip tightening on the binders. When he paused for breath, I told him calmly that if the facts made him uncomfortable, that was not something I could fix for him. I said I had given him plenty of chances to talk to me before it came to this. He laughed bitterly and turned away, pacing a few steps down the hall before spinning back around. He said I did not even live here. He said I did not understand how things worked in this town. That was when my father raised a hand and told him to stop. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened in the courtroom. Daniel stared at him, stunned. I stared too. My father did not look at me when he spoke. He told Daniel that yelling was not helping. He told him to go outside and get some air. Daniel hesitated, then stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. My father finally looked at me. His eyes were red around the edges. He said he did not know I had all that in me. He said he thought I would fold. The honesty of it caught me off guard. I did not respond right away. There was nothing to say that would soften what had already been said and done. He took a breath and said, "Your mother always said you were the strong one." He said he should have listened. The words landed awkwardly between us. They were not an apology. They were not quite an acknowledgement either. They were something in between, fragile and uncertain. My mother stood a few feet away, watching us. When our eyes met, she looked down again, then back up. Her face was lined with worry and something that looked like regret. She did not speak, but she reached out and touched my father's arm lightly, as if steadying him. We left the courthouse separately. Over the next few days, the ripples spread outward. My aunt called to tell me that people were asking questions, that neighbors had noticed my father was quieter than usual, that someone at church had mentioned the hearing in a hushed tone. I listened, absorbing it without comment. I had known this would not stay contained. My phone buzzed with messages from numbers I had not heard from in years. Some were cautious, checking in. Some were thinly veiled judgments, asking why I could not let things go. I did not answer most of them. I had spent too many years explaining myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Daniel sent a long message late one night, full of accusation and self-pity. He said I had ruined his plans. He said I had embarrassed him in front of people who mattered. He said I had crossed a line. I read it once, then deleted it. My father called a week later. His voice was subdued. He said the lawyer had explained things more clearly now. He said they would have to follow the process. He said this was not how he wanted things to go. I told him I had never wanted it to go this way either. I told him I had wanted to talk, to plan, to respect what Mom had wanted. There was a long pause on the line. When he spoke again, he said he did not know how to fix this. I told him we would start by telling the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved forward slowly. Documents were reviewed, comparisons ordered, timelines established. I participated when needed, then stepped back when there was nothing more to do. The work that had once consumed every waking moment now gave way to waiting. Waiting was harder than I expected. Without the constant focus of preparation, emotions surfaced in waves. Sadness for what had been lost long before the court date. Relief that my mother's wishes were being respected. Anger that it had taken this much effort to be heard. I let myself feel all of it, trusting that none of it would destroy me. One afternoon, I drove back to Beaver Creek. I did not tell anyone I was coming. I parked across the street from the house and sat there for a while, watching the maple tree sway gently in the breeze. The place looked unchanged, but I knew better now. Eventually, I got out of the car and walked up the path. I did not go inside. I did not need to. I stood on the porch and let the memories come. My mother laughing in the kitchen, my brother racing up the stairs, my father calling us to dinner. It was all still there, layered over the present like a second skin. I realized then that winning in court had not restored anything. It had clarified things. It had stripped away the story I had been living inside and replaced it with something truer, if more painful. When I returned home that evening, my phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Her voice was quiet. She said she had been thinking a lot. She said she was sorry she had not spoken up sooner. She said she had believed keeping the peace meant keeping everyone together. She said she saw now how much that had cost me. I listened, tears sliding down my face, saying nothing. She said she was proud of me. She said she wished she had said it more often. We talked for a long time, not solving anything, not fixing everything, but speaking honestly in a way we never had before. When we hung up, I felt both lighter and heavier, aware that some bridges could be repaired, while others would always bear the marks of old cracks. The legal outcome was no longer the center of the story. The shift in how my family saw me, and how I saw myself, mattered more. As the next hearing date approached, I found myself less anxious than I had been before. not because I expected everything to resolve neatly, but because I had already crossed the hardest threshold. I had spoken. I had been heard. Whatever came next would build on that. And as I set the binders back on the shelf where they belonged, I knew the final chapter would not be about winning or losing, but about what it meant to stand in my own life without apology. I stood there for a long moment after that thought settled, letting the quiet of my apartment wrap around me. The final hearing came and went without drama. That surprised me at first, until I realized the real conflict had already played out. The judge confirmed what had been set in motion weeks earlier. My mother's handwritten will was upheld. The house could not be sold or transferred without both heirs involved. The questionable paperwork was set aside. The process moved forward the way it should have from the beginning. When it was over, there was no rush of triumph, no sudden release, just a steady sense of rightness, like something heavy had finally been set down. A few weeks later, I drove back to Beaver Creek on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The air had turned crisp, the kind that carries the promise of change. I parked in the driveway this time, not across the street, and sat for a moment before getting out. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had finally grown into myself. My father opened the door before I knocked. He looked older than he had a year ago, not weaker, just softer around the edges. He stepped aside to let me in, his movements careful, almost tentative. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and something sweet baking in the oven. "Blueberry muffins," he said awkwardly, as if explaining himself. "Your mother used to make them." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where my mother had spent so many mornings. For a while, neither of us spoke. Silence can be uncomfortable, but it can also be honest. Finally, my father cleared his throat. He said he had been thinking a lot. He said he had spoken to a counselor at the suggestion of the court. He said it was harder than he expected. I listened. He told me he had spent his life believing that being strong meant handling things alone, making decisions quickly, never showing doubt. He said he thought he was protecting the family by doing what he thought was best. He admitted, quietly, that he had been wrong. The words did not fix everything. They were not a magic eraser, but they mattered. My mother joined us a few minutes later, moving slowly, her hand resting lightly on the back of my father's chair. She smiled at me, a real smile this time, not the careful one she used to wear. We talked about small things, the weather, the neighbors, the repairs the house still needed. It was ordinary, and somehow that made it extraordinary. Later that afternoon, my father and I stood out front with a scraper and a bucket of primer, working on the peeling trim near the porch. He complained about his knees. I teased him gently about putting off repairs for years. We laughed, softly, loud, without bitterness. The past did not disappear, but it loosened its grip. Daniel did not come by that day. He kept his distance for a while. When he did reach out, months later, it was brief and awkward. He said he was trying to sort things out. I wished him well. We were not close, but we were no longer locked in that old pattern of competition and resentment. Sometimes that is enough. As for the house, it remained standing, exactly where it had always been. A place of memory, not leverage. A place my mother had loved. Knowing that felt like closure. On the drive back home, I thought about how much energy I had spent over the years trying to be easy to live with, trying to be fine, trying to make myself small enough to fit into someone else's comfort. I had believed that strength meant endurance, silence, adaptation. I know better now. Strength is preparation. It is honesty. It is the willingness to speak when staying quiet would erase you. If you are listening to this and you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told that you would be fine when what you really needed was to be heard, I want you to know something. Your voice matters. Your preparation matters. Your story matters. Sometimes justice does not come with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through persistence and clarity and the courage to stand alone when you have to. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you have lived or are still living through, I invite you to share your thoughts or your own experiences. Staying connected helps remind us that none of us are as alone as we once believed. Thank you for being here and for listening all the way to the end.